Good afternoon. What, are we in church? What? Good afternoon. All right, it's a little better. It's a little late in the day. It's not that late in the day. How you doing? You all right? Yeah, it's an interesting time. It's an interesting. The anthropologist Victor Turner describes a time like this as liminal, a moment of liminality, in-betweenness. And the in-betweenness as a moment of both great excitement and great anxiety, sort of all together, packaged together. Also of great solidarity with the people whom you find in that moment of transition or change with you. So, welcome. I'll say a little bit about my journey here and then a few comments. I grew up in Bakersfield, California. I don't know if there's anybody here from Bakersfield, but it's an oil and agriculture town at the southern end of the San Joaquin Valley, where my father was a rabbi, my mother a teacher. And when I graduated from Bakersfield High School, my mission was to get about as far as I possibly could. With all due respect to Bakersfield, it was made infamous by John Steinbeck as the terminus of the Dust Bowl migration, Grapes of Wrath, which was actually banned in local high schools until 1972, which gives you a little sense of Bakersfield. I was fortunate enough to get a scholarship to Harvard, which was just about as far from Bakersfield as you could possibly get in almost every respect. Yeah, and if you think it was elitist, if you think it's elitist now, you should have seen it then. I think in my freshman class, I think there were 4 African-American students. There were more African students than African-American students then. And I don't know, it's interesting. If you're around for commencement, it's really instructive to watch what's called the Geezer Parade. Boy, the Geezer Parade, what could that be? The Geezer Parade is like the procession of classes, reunion classes, like starting with the class of, aught, however, early, whatever. And it's kind of interesting. It starts off and it's all kind of like little old white guys, kind of like this. And then gradually, those human evolution charts, gradually you kind of, and then you see the occasional woman, and then you see spots of color, and then it shifts, and it shifts to what it's become today, which is actually quite different than what it was then. I think 53% of the undergraduate class are, 47%, I guess, would say, are not white, are of color, which is extraordinary. It's an extraordinary shift and a very welcome one. While here, I got involved in civil rights work. It was the early 60s. I came here in 1960. That was the year John Kennedy was elected president. It was actually an extraordinary moment to come here because he came to the Yard shortly after his election talking about this new generation of leadership, and it really felt like, whoa, like suddenly I was right in the middle of what all this change was all about. But I met people involved in the civil rights movement and actually wound up volunteering for the Mississippi Summer Project after 3 years completed here after my junior year, and went to Mississippi to work with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And that was really, again, with all due respect to Harvard, where my political education began. About race, power, and politics in America, about the difference between charity and justice, and what would actually become my calling for the next 20-some years, which was the work of recruiting, identifying, developing leadership, building community around leadership, and building power from the resources of communities in order to change their way. When it came time, after 2 years in Mississippi, to come back to Harvard, it didn't seem very relevant. I actually wrote a letter to I was concentrating in history and literature. I actually wrote a letter saying, how can I come back and study history when we're busy making it? It was kind of an arrogant undergraduate thing to say, but it was also true. So instead, I went back to Bakersfield, where I'd grown up, and Cesar Chavez had just started a grape strike 30 miles from where I grew up. And the interesting thing, I'd grown up in the middle of the farm worker world, but I'd never seen it. I had to go to Mississippi. and get educated about race, power, and politics in America to go back home with what we called Mississippi eyes and see, oh, here was another community of color, also without political voice, also without economic rights. And it turns out California had its own rich history of racial segregation going back to the turn of the century, beginning with the Chinese, and as late as the 50s, desegregating movie theaters in Los Angeles that had Mexicans upstairs and whites downstairs. So it turned out that Mississippi was not an exception to America, but really an example of the America we needed to change. And I began working with Caesar in 1965 and did that for the next 16 years up until 1981. Another 10 years of union issue and electoral work, mostly in California, and then I got invited to my 25th reunion at Harvard. Now, I never graduated. I had to figure this out. I still had a year to go. Would you invite me to a reunion? I said, well, yeah, okay. Well, Harvard's pretty smart. 25 years, two things are likely to have happened. You're likely to have made some money and have a kid. And that's a convergence of interest with Harvard, so they invite you back. And there was this dropout up in Seattle who had done fairly well for himself, and that wasn't the situation with me, but it hit at a moment, and I came to that reunion. It's the first one I ever came to, and it was like running into a 20-year-old version of me that was still here. You know how when you have intense experience somewhere, you sort of leave a part of yourself there, and 20-year-old me said, well, how's it going? I said, I don't know. I've been doing this organizing work for a long time. I'm feeling stuck. I feel like I need to find a way to go deeper and go broader in order to understand where we are in all this. And so somebody said, well, so 20-year-old me said, well, why don't you push reset? Why don't you just come back and finish that year that you didn't finish so you can graduate? So I don't know. I don't know if my brain still functions. I thought about it, and the last day of the reunion, I went to see one of the deans. If he'd laughed at me, I was so fragile, that would have been the end of it, but he didn't. He turned out to be an Episcopal priest. We talked for 3 hours. We discussed the fact that tuition had changed a little bit in the intervening period of time. But we figured it out. David Illingsworth was his name. We figured it out, and so in 1991, I came back, finished my senior year, wrote a senior thesis in history and government. I'd already done the field work on that, and graduated class of 64-92. And my 81-year-old mother got to come and see her son finally become a college graduate. Yeah, it was quite a thing. Wind up in a seminar with Michael Sandel, 18 juniors and me. You know, it's like more like a gap century than a gap year, but I got the bug. And so when I finished, I continued at the Kennedy School and did the mid-career master's program in public administration there. I think I'm the only person that went from senior to mid-career in one summer. And then decided to do a PhD in sociology, and so began doing my PhD in sociology here. And while working on my PhD, I was asked to design a course on organizing at the Kennedy School, which turned out to be an extraordinary gift to me, because it was a way to practically integrate my life experience with the social science I was learning in a conversation with a rising generation. I came to think of going to class as actually, gee, you get to go and have a conversation with the future every time you go to class. So I finished the PhD in 2000 and have been on the faculty full-time at the Kennedy School since then. And I teach a course in organizing right now, people, power, and change. I'm doing a distance learning version now for the 4th year. We have 110 students in 20 countries right now that we work with over WebEx on organizing and leadership development. And in the fall, I teach a class on what I call public narrative and an undergraduate seminar as well. So that's sort of how I wound up being here. And I just, well, one last thing. I also discovered the Academy does not have to be an ivory tower. It can be a place from which to work, from which to engage with the world. It's not a choice. It's not about leaving the world. It's my students who brought me back into much more active work with Howard Dean's campaign in 2003, with the Dreamers, with the Obama campaign in 2007, because I've been blessed with being able to combine practice, research, and teaching all around the same set of questions. of how people can work with one another to empower themselves to transform the world in which they live. So, 3 comments. First, things you might consider. First, consider where you're going to be most able to pursue your own calling, to figure out your calling. And I'm talking about calling, not career. I'm talking about paying attention to what actually moves you. You know, to where that deep curiosity is, what's drawing you. And it's not something that you necessarily know at this point. So the real question is, where can you figure it out? Where can you explore and learn it? Cesar Chavez used to say, it's not so much making the right decision as making the decision you make the right decision. Where are you going to have the opportunity to make the most of it, to figure that out? You know, life's not linear. And, you know, I never expected to be here doing what I'm doing. And really, this whole notion of planning 30 years, you know, I know what I'm going to do, and just forget, I mean, it's nonsense. What is what's next. What's next is what matters. That's what you can actually decide. You can't predict the future. And so think about what's next step for you. What's going to give you the context, the opportunity. Pay attention to your heart, because emotions tell us a lot about the world. They are not to be put aside. They inform us about what really matters in the world. So please pay attention. Second, consider who you want to learn among. And I don't mean just the faculty, although faculty is great, we've heard about that, but consider the other students. The fall class I teach on public narrative, I have 140 students. They're from 31 different countries. It's not just about having a conversation with the future, it's having a conversation with the world. That's extraordinary. You know, that just doesn't happen every place. And so thinking about the opportunity to encounter the world as it's changing around us and learning in that context is can be an enormously energizing thing. And finally, consider where you want to challenge. And what I mean by that is institutions need challenge. Otherwise, they ossify, they become irrelevant, and they die. Should you come to, well, wherever you come, respect your own experience. You bring, not to get stuck in, but to appreciate and to stand on. And to understand that your encounter with any institution is a two-way deal. It's a two-way deal. And if the institution's not listening, then you need to do what you can to make it listen. Because that's in the institution's interest as well as your own. Does that make sense? I mean, I think it's like, and the university has this incredible opportunity because new students bring the world's experience with them here. And the institution ignores that to its own peril. The first place I ever picketed was here. We had discovered that Harvard owned stock in Mississippi Power and Light Company. You think divestment is a new thing? This was back in '64. And so some of us went to Atlanta and met with the SNCC staff, and they said, oh, we've got to try to do something with Harvard. We came back, and the first place we picketed, President Pusey of Harvard, he was our target for our picket line. There is another side to this institution. I don't know how many folks know about John Reed, the guy who wrote 10 Days That Shook the World. There's a little portrait of him in Adams' house. There is another Harvard that is contentious, it's challenging, it's creative, and it's really important to appreciate that as well, because Harvard, if it doesn't welcome challenge, it can handle it, and in fact can benefit from it. So think about where you want to go in terms of a place. I guess I think of this as a place where the future is being conceived, it's being shaped. The people who are shaping it come through here, encounter one another, emerge changed, and in that way influence the world from whence they came. So think about where and with who and for what purpose. Thank you.